friends. Hopefully you'll be able to keep hearing me. We're at the end of Deuteronomy. We are almost at the very closing of the book of Deuteronomy. There's only a few verses left after this section. And what we see here is Moses at the very end of his life, and at the end of this journey, is sharing this incredible story, is sharing a poem, really. And it's more like a charge. But in order for me, I think, to really appreciate what he's doing, you have to remember in the very beginning of the story of when we first meet Moses in the book of Exodus, and he leaves Egypt himself after he kills the taskmaster. He's in Midian and up on this mountain and hears God calling him. And God has a job for him to do, and Moses wants to get out of the job. Moses does not want to take this particular job. And why? One of the reasons is because he says that he's slow of speech, that he's not a good speaker. Some commentators said that he had a stutter. Maybe he had some other kind of disability. Whatever it was, 3 different times Moses tries to get out of this particular calling, which I'm very sensitive to. He tries to get out of this calling, but to no avail. He is given the charge, he takes it, and then he does what we're so familiar with. The very end of the Torah now, the very end of Deuteronomy, we see that this man, more than 40 years ago, who didn't want the job, who had a stutter, now says, Hazinu, give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter. So the one who couldn't speak so well is now going to give this incredible oration. He is a speaker, and he tells heaven and earth to listen to this message. And he goes on with this very lengthy poem, his last song, if you will. Now, if you read the text closely, you're going to see that he's not singing sweetly, but he's giving a charge to the Israelites. These Israelites who are born free, they are not the ones who left Egypt. They are the first generation born free, but who still have an experience of the trauma of their parents being enslaved. And he is charging them and asking, really pleading with them to listen. Listen to what he has to say. There's a rabbi, David Novak, who said something that I've never been able to let go of. He said, the one who could not speak has found his voice. The one who could not speak, Moses, has found his voice. Not because he gave this incredible poem out loud, but because he had something to say. Because he used his words and his voice in order to tell the people that as they were going into the land and they were going to build something new and extraordinary that God had planned, it was really going to be up to them if it was going to happen or not. They needed to show up. After this long poem, at the very, very end, he says something that I think is really challenging. At the end of chapter 32, he says, "For this is not a trifling thing for you. It is your very life." I'll say it again. He says, this is not a trifling thing for you. It is your very life. Literally, the Hebrew text is, this is not an empty thing from you. Not a trifling thing for you or to you, but the Hebrew, ki lo davar rik hu mikem, is not an empty thing from you. Clearly, he's saying that it's important, that it's not empty. What's he talking about? Of course, he's talking about Torah. But he says, really, it's not an empty thing from you. I think there's a part of our consciousness, I really do, that comes from standing at Sinai together. And we were there. I believe that with a whole heart. Not so much with a full brain, but totally with a full heart. We were all at Sinai together. It's something that links us all in this community and to Jewish communities around the world. And for all of those who join us, these godly teachings are a part of us, the very fabric of our lives. In the beginning of the Torah, we read about a garden, a paradise, and it has these two trees. One, of course, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or good and bad. And after taking of this tree, there's a recognition that we have to make choices. But the other tree is part of our Torah story, the tree of life. Torah is here to help us choose life, a life of goodness and a life of meaning. After taking from the tree of knowledge, they had to learn how to choose and make choices. And we are still learning how to do that today in order to make our lives meaningful. I would say it's not so easy. We get tired and we get frustrated, maybe bored or distracted by shiny new things. But there is a connection to the divine and to truth, which for me, that truth comes from Torah, and that's in all of us. If we were to let Torah really speak to us from within, if we respond to it instead of only picking the comfortable parts that we might be in agreement with, I really do think it can bring meaning to our lives. And without meaning, I think we're really lost. So yeah, at the end of Moses's poem, I think our lives depend on this. Now I know what you're thinking, Rabbi, that's a little too religious for me. My life is going to depend on Torah? Come on. So let's try it this way. The Torah in me says that there have been over 200,000 deaths in our country because of COVID-19. The Torah in me says that is not a number. Those are souls. Those are parents and kids, siblings, aunts, uncles, and so much more. The Torah in me says we have to look not at the number, but at the individual soul. And we know that this is true because when we talk about the intensity of 6 million, most people don't know what to do about that. It's so amorphous. It is out there. That little Tennessee school, do you remember watching years ago a documentary called Paper Clips? They wanted to show what 6 million paper clips look like and how enormous that was and how long it took in order to make the number real. Well, it's always been real for us. I think it's real for our grandparents and aunts and uncles, and even for some of us, even in these screens. But the Torah in me tells me that over 203,000 people who died in America is not a number. 985,000 deaths worldwide is a catastrophe. A catastrophe. And the Torah that is in us can help us recognize what our responsibilities are for one another in this society, in this country, and for our world. It is not about our wants. It's not about our conveniences. A sense of responsibility is what we get to glean from Torah. And yes, that's hard because sometimes we don't want to be responsible. Sometimes I just want to run away and hide a little bit. I get it. We all do, but we can't live there. The Torah in us has us calling out truths that we get to witness. Now, I, like you, I'm really pained to hear our Boulder city government has to restrict movements of young adults in our city because there isn't always a sense of responsibility. For most, I'm sure, yes. I don't want to whitewash just young people in general, but yeah, there are too many that are not taking this seriously enough, and they're not listening to the Torah or whatever it is inside of them that can help them bring meaning. Our Tikkun Olam committee, I just got an email from our Tikkun Olam committee asking parents with young adults at home to encourage us to encourage them to vote. Not for who, but just to vote. That it is their civic responsibility to engage in a wider conversation and make choices about how we're going to live. Moses found his voice, and he is saying now, today, to you and to me, that we have received something profound, something that has been shaped ever since Eden, and we met the tree of life for the first time. The Torah, the tree of life, God created a system where we get to make choices, real choices, and Torah gets to help inform us about making the best choice possible. And I'm sharing this with you tonight because we are in the midst of these holiest of days. Again, you could tell by our melodies and the extra pieces of liturgy about remembrance and being inscribed and sealed in this book. But the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, the 10 days of Teshuvah, of turning, of changing, of realigning, of reflecting, and of changing our ways. If it only stays in our own head without making a change in our world, I think it's for naught. If it doesn't move me to make a change in my life and how I behave, well, then what are we doing here? If we can recognize that there's a Torah in us. In fact, I think your very life is Torah. And you get to write an amazing book this year to help be present for others and bring healing to a broken world. I'm no Moses, that's for sure. But I'm here to say that this Shabbat, you are your brother's keeper. We are the ones who are commanded to be pursuers of peace and justice, that we are to love the stranger, this neighbor, and the citizen alike. And this is no ordinary new year. For Holly and I and just a couple of other people to be in our empty sanctuary without you during these holy days was one of the loneliest and hardest experiences of my life. No doubt about it. It didn't make sense to me. I'm grateful that it was good for lots of people on the screens who are watching and praying and joining. But as a leader, it didn't feel like I was leading anyone. That's just one little insight into how strange this year is. And the truth is, I don't need to tell you that. You're listening to yet another sermon through Zoom. We started our schmooze together saying how we missed being together. So this is no ordinary year. And I think it's time for us to start to listen to the Torah in us. And I know how we are usually the ones that say, where was God during these hard times? But you know what? God's been asking the same question for centuries, millennia. After all of these truths and teachings that God has been sharing to one people or another, God still asks, Ayeka, where are you? And why are we doing this to one another? To my children, God might say. So this is no trifling thing. This is our very lives. Let's bring out the Torah inside of us to help bring healing, to help bring wholeness and inspiration to our very broken and fractured world. Friends, it's time to find our own voice. Yours and mine and ours as a community. So I invite you to take a breath. Let's move to the conclusion, 5